Hey everyone, tonight we're sailing into the stormy waters of Viking history, where the truth is far stranger than the myths we've all been taught. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy having your historical assumptions turned upside down, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see our global crew of history enthusiasts gathering together. Picture this: a bearded warrior with a horned helmet, wielding a massive axe jumping from a dragon-headed longship to pillage a monastery. That's the Viking everyone knows, right? Well, here's the thing. Almost everything in that mental image is either wrong, exaggerated, or completely made up by later generations who thought real Viking history wasn't exciting enough. Spoiler alert, actual Viking history is far more fascinating than the cartoon version we've been sold. The Vikings have become the ultimate historical action figures, reduced to one-dimensional raiders in popular culture. Hollywood loves them because they're supposedly simple, big, brutal, and beardy. Video games love them because they're supposedly all about combat and conquest. Even our history books often present them as little more than medieval terrorists who showed up, destroyed everything, and then vanished into the frozen north. But here's what nobody tells you. The Vikings were master traders who created the first global economy, reaching from Greenland to Baghdad. They were explorers who discovered America 500 years before Columbus was even born. They were poets and storytellers whose sagas influenced literature for 1,000 years. They had a complex legal system, surprisingly progressive women's rights, and a hygiene routine that would put most medieval Europeans to shame. The word Viking itself is misunderstood. It wasn't even an ethnic group or a nationality. It was more like a job description. Going Viking meant going on an expedition, usually for trade, sometimes for raiding, often for both. Most Norse people never went Viking at all. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and families just trying to survive in a harsh northern climate. Calling all medieval Scandinavians Vikings is like calling all Americans Marines. Technically some are, but it misses the bigger picture entirely. So how did we get it all so wrong? Blame a combination of medieval propaganda, Victorian romanticism, and modern pop culture's addiction to simplification. The people who wrote about Vikings at the time were usually their victims, monks and chroniclers who had every reason to paint them as demons from the north. Then the Victorians got hold of Viking history and added their own fantasies, including those ridiculous horned helmets. By the time Hollywood discovered Vikings, the real story was buried under so many layers of fiction that finding the truth became an archaeological expedition in itself. Tonight we're going to excavate that truth. We'll discover why Vikings never wore horned helmets, why they weren't particularly tall or brutish, and why they definitely didn't drink from skull cups. We'll explore how they were actually obsessed with cleanliness, had a sophisticated understanding of navigation that would impress modern sailors, and created one of the most extensive trade networks the medieval world had ever seen. We'll uncover the reality of Viking women, who could own land, run businesses, and divorce their husbands, rights that wouldn't appear in most of Europe for another 1,000 years. We'll examine their actual religious beliefs, which were far more complex than just Odin and Valhalla, and we'll discover how Viking society was organised, how their legal system worked, and why they were actually respected diplomats and negotiators when they weren't raiding. The Vikings shaped the modern world in ways most people never realise. They founded cities from Dublin to Kiev. Their DNA is scattered across Europe, not through conquest but through integration and intermarriage. They were the venture capitalists of the medieval world, funding expeditions that open trade routes still used today. They even gave us the names of our weekdays. Thursday is Thor's Day, Friday is Freya's Day. But perhaps most importantly, we'll see how the Viking Age ended not with a bang, but with a gradual transformation. Vikings didn't disappear. They became the ancestors of modern Scandinavians, Russians, Normans, and countless others. Their descendants went on to conquer England properly in 1066, establish the Kingdom of Sicily, and serve as the elite guard of Byzantine emperors. Let's start with the most persistent and ridiculous Viking myth of all time, those iconic horned helmets. You know the ones. Two curved horns jutting majestically from either side of a warrior's head, making them look like a cross between a medieval soldier and an angry bull. They're on every Viking Halloween costume in every cartoon, on the logo of the Minnesota Vikings. There's just one tiny problem. Vikings never wore them. Not once. Not ever. Not even on casual Fridays. The actual Viking helmet was about as exciting as a construction hard hat. The few authentic Viking helmets we've found, and we're talking about literally a handful from the entire Viking Age, are simple, practical, and completely hornless. The most famous is the Gjermundbu helmet discovered in Norway, dating from the 10th century. It's a rounded iron cap with a nose guard and eye protection. That's it. No horns, no wings, no decorative antlers. Just a functional piece of armour designed to keep your skull in one piece during battle. Think about it for a moment. You're in the middle of a chaotic medieval battle. Swords are swinging, axes are flying, and you're trying to stay alive in a writhing mass of armed men. The last thing you want is two giant handles sticking out of your head that enemies can grab, twist, or use to snap your neck like a fortune cookie. Horns on a helmet would be like wearing a "please kill me" sign in the middle of combat. So where did this nonsense come from? Blame the 19th century, when Europe was going through a massive Viking revival. Opera composer Richard Wagner needed his Norse heroes to look dramatic on stage, so costume designers added horns to make them appear more imposing under the stage lights. The look was so striking that it stuck, spreading like a historical virus through popular culture. Before Wagner, nobody associated Vikings with horned helmets. After Wagner, nobody could imagine them without them. But the 19th century didn't invent this idea from thin air. They were actually mixing up Vikings with much older artefacts. Bronze Age ceremonial helmets with horns did exist in Scandinavia, but these were from over 1,000 years before the Viking Age. These weren't battle gear, they were religious items, probably worn by priests during rituals. Imagine archaeologists 3,000 years from now finding a pope's mitre and assuming all 21st century Europeans wore tall pointed hats into battle. That's essentially what happened with Viking helmets. The Victorian era loved to romanticise Vikings as noble savages, and horned helmets fit perfectly into their fantasy. They wanted Vikings to look primitive, barbaric, and distinctly other. The horns made them seem more like forces of nature than regular humans, storm demons from the frozen north. It was visual shorthand for dangerous but fascinating, which sold tickets to operas and books to readers hungry for exotic adventure. The myth got another boost from early archaeological mistakes. When 19th century antiquarians found ancient horned helmets in Denmark, they immediately assumed old plus Scandinavian equals Viking. They didn't have modern dating techniques, so anything old and Nordic got lumped into the Viking category. By the time proper archaeology sorted out the timeline, the damage was done. The image had already burned itself into popular consciousness. Real Viking helmets tell a different story about Norse warriors. First, most Vikings probably didn't wear helmets at all. Iron was expensive, and a helmet represented a significant investment. The average Viking raider was more likely to wear a thick leather cap or nothing at all on their head, trusting to luck, skill, and the gods for protection. Only wealthy warriors and professional soldiers could afford proper iron helmets. When Vikings did wear helmets, they were remarkably practical about it. The designs were simple but effective, offering good protection without unnecessary weight or complications. Some had mail aventails, chainmail curtains that protected the neck. Others had reinforced face guards or cheek plates. Every design choice was about survival, not style. These were tools, not fashion statements. The irony is that Vikings did care deeply about their appearance, just not in the way pop culture imagines. They were actually quite vain, spending considerable time on their hair and beards, wearing jewellery and decorating their weapons. But their warrior aesthetic was about looking wealthy and well-maintained, not savage and bestial. A Viking warrior wanted to look like someone who could afford good equipment, and had the leisure time to maintain it, not like a crazed berserker with antlers. Archaeological evidence suggests Vikings were actually quite conservative in their military equipment. They adopted successful designs from other cultures, the Spangenhelm from the Frankish kingdoms, mail armour from the Romans and Byzantines. They were pragmatists, not fantasists. If horned helmets had offered any tactical advantage, they would have used them. The fact that they didn't tells us everything we need to know about the practicality of horns in combat. The horned helmet myth has become so entrenched that it's almost impossible to shake. Every time someone tries to depict historically accurate Vikings, they face a dilemma. Give the audience what they expect, horns, or what's real, no horns, and risk confusion. Most choose the horns because the image is so powerful, so immediately recognisable. It's visual shorthand that says Viking more effectively than any amount of historical accuracy. But this myth matters because it represents something larger. how we've turned the Vikings into cartoons rather than understanding them as real people. The horned helmet is a symbol of all the ways we've simplified, exaggerated, and fantasized about Viking culture. It's the tip of a very large iceberg of misconceptions, each one taking us further from the fascinating truth of who these people really were. Here's something that would shock most people. Vikings were probably the cleanest people in medieval Europe. While the rest of the continent was suspicious of bathing, thinking it might let evil spirits in through their pores, Vikings were practically obsessed with personal hygiene. They bathed weekly, groomed fastidiously, and even had a specific day designated for washing. Saturday in Old Norse was called Laugardagar, literally washing day or pool day. Medieval English chroniclers actually complained about this. They were genuinely upset that Viking men in England were stealing their women, and they blamed it on the fact that Vikings bathed too often, combed their hair daily, and changed their clothes regularly. John of Wallingford, writing in the 13th century about earlier Viking settlers, grumbled that the Danes combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and regularly changed their woolens, and that this helped them seduce English women. Imagine being so dirty that you think basic hygiene is cheating at romance. Archaeological evidence backs up these written complaints. Viking settlements are littered with grooming implements: combs, tweezers, razors, and ear spoons. Yes, ear spoons. Vikings had special tools just for cleaning their ears. These weren't rare luxury items either. They show up in graves of all social classes. Even the average Viking farmer owned a personal grooming kit that would put many modern bathroom cabinets to shame. The combs deserve special attention. Vikings didn't just own combs, they were obsessed with them. Made from antler or bone, often beautifully decorated, combs were carried everywhere. Warriors took them on raids. Merchants packed them for long journeys. People were buried with their combs, presumably so they could maintain their hairstyles in the afterlife. Some Vikings even wore their combs in special cases hanging from their belts, like a medieval Swiss Army knife of personal grooming. Viking grooming went far beyond basic cleanliness. They bleached their beards with lye to achieve a fashionable golden colour. They used tweezers to pluck unwanted hair and shape their eyebrows. They wore kohl around their eyes. Yes, Viking warriors wore eyeliner. Arab chronicler Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who met Vikings in the 10th century, noted that both men and women used makeup to enhance their appearance. These weren't unwashed barbarians, they were the fashion-conscious trendsetters of their time. Their bathing habits were equally sophisticated. When possible, Vikings preferred to bathe in hot springs or heated bathhouses. They built saunas, which they called badstoffer, wherever they settled. In Iceland, where hot springs were abundant, bathing became a social activity. People would gather at public pools to wash, socialise, and even conduct business. The Icelandic sagas are full of important conversations and negotiations that happened in bathhouses. When hot water wasn't available, Vikings still prioritised cleanliness. They washed in rivers, lakes, or with heated water in wooden tubs. They used soap made from animal fat and ash, which they manufactured themselves. This wasn't just splashing some water on their faces, they had a whole routine. Hair was washed and carefully styled, beards were trimmed and shaped, nails were cleaned and cut. The whole process was taken seriously. The contrast with the rest of medieval Europe is striking. While Vikings were bathing weekly, many Europeans believed bathing was dangerous to health. The Catholic Church sometimes preached against excessive washing, viewing it as vanity. Public bathhouses in medieval European cities were often associated with prostitution and sin. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the bathhouse was a respectable social institution, as important to community life as the church or market. Viking dental hygiene was surprisingly advanced too. They cleaned their teeth with twigs, similar to modern miswak sticks still used in some cultures. Some Vikings even filed decorative grooves into their teeth, which they filled with coloured resin. This wasn't about hygiene precisely, but it shows they cared about their dental appearance enough to undergo what must have been a painful cosmetic procedure. The importance of cleanliness in Viking culture extended to their homes and possessions. Houses were regularly cleaned, with floors swept and fresh rushes laid down. Clothes were washed and mended, kitchen implements were scoured. This wasn't just practical, cleanliness had social and religious significance. Being dirty or unkempt could damage your reputation and standing in the community. There's a wonderful irony in how we imagine Vikings versus how they actually were. Popular culture depicts them as filthy, blood-caked warriors who never met a bath they didn't avoid. In reality, a Viking stepping out of his longship after a raid probably smelled better than the monks he was about to rob. Those monks, following medieval Christian ideas about the sinfulness of the flesh, might not have bathed in months. The Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who met Viking traders on the Volga River, did describe some Vikings as the filthiest of God's creatures. But his account needs context. First, he was judging them by Islamic standards of cleanliness, which involved washing 5 times daily for prayer. Second, he was describing merchants on a long journey, not Vikings in their homes. Even he noted that they washed their faces and hands daily, though he was disgusted that they shared the same bowl of water. This obsession with cleanliness makes perfect sense when you understand Viking culture. These were people who valued appearance, status, and social standing. In a society where your reputation determined everything from marriage prospects to trade deals, maintaining your appearance was a survival strategy. Being well-groomed showed you were prosperous enough to afford soap and leisure time, disciplined enough to maintain standards, and socially aware enough to care what others thought. The cleanliness myth also intersects with gender in interesting ways. Viking women were equally concerned with hygiene and appearance. They wore their hair long and elaborately styled, often with complex braids that required significant time and skill to create. They used combs, mirrors, and cosmetics. They perfumed their clothes with pleasant-smelling herbs. The stereotype of Viking women as rough shield maidens ignores how much time and effort they put into personal grooming. Even Viking slaves or thralls were expected to maintain basic cleanliness. Sagas mention masters providing soap and washing facilities for their slaves. This wasn't kindness, it was practicality. Clean slaves were healthier, more valuable, and reflected better on their owners. A wealthy Viking with dirty slaves would be like a modern executive with a filthy car. It suggested poverty or carelessness. The image of Vikings as mindless, bloodthirsty killers who lived only for battle is perhaps the most damaging misconception of all. Yes, violence was part of Viking culture, as it was for every medieval society. But the idea that Vikings were uniquely savage, that they gloried in bloodshed above all else, is medieval propaganda that has somehow survived into modern times. The truth is far more complex. Vikings were calculating opportunists who preferred trade to raid whenever possible, and who had sophisticated rules governing when and how violence could be used. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Viking raids. Yes, they happened. Yes, they were brutal, but they were also strategic, carefully planned, and often aimed at specific economic or political goals. Vikings didn't raid because they loved violence. They raided because it was profitable. Monasteries were targeted not because Vikings had a particular hatred for Christianity, but because monasteries were wealthy and poorly defended. It was the medieval equivalent of robbing banks because, as Willie Sutton supposedly said, that's where the money is. The famous Viking berserkers, those legendary warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, have been wildly exaggerated in popular culture. First, berserkers were rare, even in Viking society. They were specialists, often associated with particular cults or warrior bands, not representative of Viking warriors in general. Most Viking fighters were farmers and traders who picked up weapons when necessary, not professional killing machines. The word berserk itself has been misunderstood. It probably comes from bear shirt, referring to warriors who wore bear pelts in battle. These were ritual warriors, possibly associated with shamanic practices, who used psychological warfare as much as physical violence. The idea that they fought naked, foaming at the mouth, immune to pain, that's mostly later embellishment. Sagas describe berserkers as problems even in Viking society, unstable individuals who were as likely to turn on their allies as their enemies. Real Viking warfare was actually quite sophisticated. They used shield walls, coordinated tactics, and disciplined formations. The popular image of Vikings as wild barbarians charging chaotically into battle would have gotten them slaughtered by the organised armies of England, Francia, or Byzantium. Viking success came from superior mobility, strategic intelligence, and the ability to strike where enemies were weakest, not from being more savage than their opponents. The numbers tell an interesting story. For every Viking raid recorded in historical sources, there were probably dozens of peaceful trading expeditions that nobody bothered to write about. Vikings established permanent trading posts from Ireland to Russia, and these weren't military bases, they were commercial centres. The vast majority of Vikings who left Scandinavia were traders, not raiders. They went abroad to make money, and violence was just one tool among many. Consider the Varangians, Vikings who travelled down Russian rivers to trade with Byzantium and the Islamic world. They fought when necessary, but their primary goal was commerce. They traded furs, amber and slaves for Islamic silver, Byzantine silk and exotic goods. Many served as mercenaries not because they loved fighting, but because it paid well. The famous Varangian Guard, the elite unit that protected Byzantine emperors, were professionals, not berserkers. Viking society had complex laws governing violence. The Thing, their assembly, dealt with disputes through legal procedures, not blood feuds. Killing someone, even an enemy, without proper justification could result in outlawry, essentially a death sentence. The sagas are full of legal proceedings, careful negotiations, and attempts to avoid violence through compensation. The stereotype of Vikings immediately reaching for axes whenever annoyed is contradicted by their own literature. The concept of honour in Viking society is often misunderstood. Yes, honour was important, but it wasn't just about fighting. Honour came from generosity, from keeping your word, from being a good host, from composing poetry. A Viking who was quick to violence without cause was considered not honourable, but untrustworthy, someone who couldn't control themselves. The ideal Viking leader was someone who knew when to fight and when to negotiate. Viking literature reveals a culture that was deeply ambivalent about violence. The sagas don't glorify bloodshed, they treat it as tragedy. Heroes who resort to violence often face terrible consequences. The greatest heroes are those who try to avoid conflict, who seek peaceful solutions, who only fight when forced. Even in stories about warriors, the emphasis is on cleverness, loyalty and wisdom, not brutality. The peaceful side of Viking expansion is rarely discussed. Iceland was settled almost entirely without violence. There was nobody there to fight. Vikings in Iceland created one of the world's first parliaments, the Althing, specifically to resolve disputes without bloodshed. They developed a complex legal system, a rich literary tradition, and a society that functioned for centuries with no king and no standing army. When Vikings settled in new lands, they typically integrated with local populations rather than exterminating them. In England, Vikings, called Danes, merged with Anglo-Saxons to create a hybrid culture. In Normandy, Vikings became French. In Russia, they became Slavic. This isn't the behaviour of mindless killers. It's the pattern of adaptable immigrants who are more interested in prosperity than purity. The economic reality of Viking society also contradicts the bloodthirsty stereotype. Most Vikings were farmers, and farming requires stability, planning and cooperation. You can't maintain a farm while constantly going on killing sprees. The agricultural calendar dictated Viking activities. Raids happened in summer after planting and before harvest, when farmers had free time. The rest of the year these supposed berserkers were worried about crop yields and livestock. Viking craftsmanship tells another story. These people created beautiful art, intricate metalwork, sophisticated ships, and complex poetry. The same hands that supposedly lived only for blood also created delicate jewellery, carved elaborate decorations and built architectural marvels. The cognitive dissonance required to see Vikings as both mindless berserkers and skilled artisans should make us question our assumptions. Women in Viking society provide perhaps the strongest evidence against the bloodthirsty stereotype. While men were away on expeditions, women ran households, managed estates, and maintained the economy. They couldn't do this if Viking society was in constant violent chaos. The stability and prosperity of Viking Age Scandinavia required long periods of peace, careful management, and sophisticated social organisation. The religious beliefs of Vikings also complicate the violent stereotype. Yes, Valhalla was for warriors who died in battle, but it wasn't the only afterlife, or even the most desirable one for many Vikings. Hell, the realm of the peaceful dead, was where most people expected to go, and it wasn't seen as punishment. Many Vikings preferred the idea of residing with their ancestors in burial mounds, protecting their descendants. The obsession with Valhalla is largely a modern fixation. Popular culture has reduced Viking religion to a simple formula. warriors worship Odin, die gloriously in battle, go to Valhalla, fight all day, feast all night, repeat until Ragnarok. It's a compelling image, but it's about as accurate as saying all Christians want to become angels playing harps on clouds. Viking religious beliefs were incredibly diverse, regionally specific, and changed dramatically over the 3 centuries of the Viking Age. Most Vikings probably cared more about local land spirits and harvest goddesses than the high drama of Odin's warrior cult. Let's start with an uncomfortable truth. We don't really know what most Vikings believed. Our sources for Norse mythology, the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, were written down by Christians centuries after the Viking Age ended. Imagine trying to reconstruct modern Christianity based solely on Paradise Lost and the Chronicles of Narnia, written by Buddhists in the year 2500. That's essentially what we're working with for Viking religion. The god everyone associates with Vikings, Odin, the All-Father, the One-Eyed Wanderer, was probably not the most popular deity among ordinary Vikings. Odin was complex, dangerous, and untrustworthy. He was the god of kings, poets, and warriors, but also of madness, deception, and death. Sagas describe him as someone who broke oaths, betrayed followers, and stirred up conflicts for his own mysterious purposes. Not exactly someone you'd want to rely on for a good harvest or safe childbirth. Thor was far more popular among common Vikings. He was straightforward, reliable, and protected ordinary people from chaos. While Odin was playing complicated games with kings and heroes, Thor was killing giants, blessing marriages, and ensuring the crops grew. His hammer wasn't just a weapon. It was used to consecrate weddings, bless newborns, and sanctify important decisions. Thor was the working man's god, the deity you actually wanted on your side. But even the Thor versus Odin dichotomy is too simple. Viking religion was fundamentally local. Every region, every family, sometimes every farmstead had its own specific traditions and preferences. A fishing village might primarily worship Njord, god of the sea. A farming community might focus on Freyr and Freyja, the fertility deities. Women often had completely different religious practices from men, centering on goddesses like Frigg and Freya. The Vanir gods, Njord, Freyr and Freyja, represented fertility, prosperity, and pleasure. They were probably older than the Aesir, Odin's family, and remained extremely important throughout the Viking Age. Freyr, with his giant phallus and association with good harvests, received more sacrifices than Odin in many regions. The Uppsala temple in Sweden, one of the most important religious sites in Scandinavia, was dedicated to Freyr, not Odin. Then there were the countless minor deities and spirits that populated the Viking spiritual landscape. Every rock, stream and grove might have its own spirit. Land wights protected specific territories. House spirits guarded families. Ancestors remained active in the world, requiring offerings and respect. These local spirits probably received more daily attention than the grand gods of mythology. The concept of Valhalla has been grotesquely oversimplified. First, Valhalla was only for elite warriors who died in battle. Not just any battle, but significant ones. Maybe half of those warriors went to Valhalla, the other half went to Freyja's hall, Folkvanger. But most Vikings didn't die in battle. They died of disease, old age, accidents, childbirth. They expected to go to Hell, which wasn't a place of punishment but simply where ordinary dead people went. Hell, ruled by the goddess of the same name, was described as cold and gloomy but not torturous. It was where you reunited with your ancestors, where families were together again. For many Vikings, this was preferable to an eternity of fighting and dying repeatedly in Valhalla. The modern obsession with Valhalla says more about our culture's glorification of warrior death than about actual Viking beliefs. Some Vikings believed in residing in their burial mounds after death, becoming protective spirits for their descendants. Ship burials suggest some believed in sailing to the afterlife. Grave goods indicate beliefs in an afterlife that required earthly possessions. These varied, sometimes contradictory beliefs existed simultaneously, because Viking religion wasn't a unified doctrine, but a collection of regional traditions. The conversion to Christianity reveals how flexible Viking religion really was. It didn't happen overnight through dramatic confrontations between Thor's hammer and Christ's cross. Instead, it was a gradual process of syncretism and adaptation. Many Vikings saw no problem with worshipping Christ alongside their traditional gods. Jesus was just another powerful deity who might help in certain situations. Christian Vikings often continued practicing traditional rituals just with different names. They still left offerings at sacred springs, but now they called them holy wells. They still celebrated midwinter feasts, but now they called it Christmas. Thor's hammer pendants morphed into crosses, sometimes with designs that could be interpreted as either. This religious flexibility shows Vikings were more practical than fanatical about their beliefs. The supposedly warlike nature of Viking religion is also overstated. Yes, there were warrior cults, but there were also fertility cults, poetry cults, and trading cults. Bragi was the god of poetry. Idun guarded the apples of immortality. Balder was beloved for his beauty and gentleness. The Norse pantheon included deities of justice, wisdom, and craftsmanship, not just war and death. Viking religious practices were equally diverse. While human sacrifice did occur, it was rare and usually associated with royal funerals or extreme circumstances. Most religious observances involved feasting, drinking, and animal sacrifice, basically community barbecues with religious overtones. The blot, the main sacrificial ritual, was as much about communal bonding as divine worship. Cider, a form of Norse magic associated with Freyja, complicates our understanding even further. It was primarily practiced by women and considered inappropriate for men, yet Odin himself was a master of it. This suggests complex gender dynamics in Viking religion that don't fit our stereotypes. Women could be powerful religious practitioners, priestesses and vulvas, seeresses, who commanded respect and fear. The runes, often portrayed as mystical Viking symbols, were primarily just an alphabet. While they had religious associations and were used for divination, most runic inscriptions are mundane. Thorstein owns this comb, or Ragnhild is a good woman. The mystical runic magic of popular culture is largely a modern invention, though Vikings did believe in the power of words and writing. The phrase rape and pillage has become so synonymous with Vikings that it's practically their tagline. Every Viking movie, TV show and video game seems contractually obligated to include scenes of Norse warriors burning villages and terrorizing populations. While Vikings certainly did raid and could be brutal, reducing their entire civilization to these acts is like defining modern America solely by its military interventions. The reality is that Vikings were primarily traders and settlers who built far more than they destroyed, and their interactions with other cultures were more often peaceful than violent. Let's address the uncomfortable reality first. Yes, Viking raids could be devastating. Monasteries were sacked, towns were burned, and people were killed or enslaved. The famous prayer, "From the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord," reflects genuine terror. But this terror needs context. Every medieval power engaged in similar behaviour. Charlemagne massacred thousands of Saxons. English kingdoms constantly raided each other. The Byzantines weren't known for their gentleness. Vikings weren't uniquely brutal. They were just very good at what everyone was doing. The focus on Viking violence often obscures a crucial fact. For every Viking raid, there were probably dozens of peaceful trading missions that nobody recorded. Merchants don't make exciting chronicle entries. Northmen came, sold furs, bought wine, left peacefully. Doesn't have the same narrative punch as demons from the sea destroyed everything we hold dear. The historical record is biased toward violence because violence was considered worth recording. Viking trade networks were staggeringly extensive. They connected Scandinavia to Constantinople, Baghdad, and possibly even Central Asia and India. Viking merchants travelled thousands of miles, learned multiple languages, and navigated complex political situations. They established permanent trading posts, negotiated treaties, and created the first international economy. This wasn't the work of mindless raiders, but sophisticated business people. The silver economy that fueled Viking expansion came primarily from trade, not raiding. Hundreds of thousands of Islamic silver dirhams have been found in Scandinavia, far more than could have been obtained through raiding alone. These coins came through legitimate trade along the Volga route, where Vikings exchanged furs, amber and slaves for precious metals. The economic data tells a story of commerce, not just conquest. When Vikings settled in new lands, they typically integrated rather than dominated. In England, the Danelaw became a prosperous region where Norse and English cultures merged. Vikings introduced new words into English: skill, knife, husband, berserk, new legal concepts, and new agricultural techniques. They didn't destroy English culture, they enriched it. Modern English wouldn't exist without Viking influence. The integration was often remarkably peaceful. In many areas, Vikings were invited to settle by local rulers who needed their military expertise or wanted to develop trade. The Vikings who founded Dublin, Cork and other Irish cities came as traders and gradually became part of Irish society. They intermarried, adopted local customs and contributed to Irish culture. The foreign devastators became neighbours, in-laws and eventually simply Irish. Viking legal systems provide strong evidence against the rape and pillage stereotype. Norse law was sophisticated, with detailed provisions for property rights, inheritance, and compensation for injurers. The Thing, assembly, resolved disputes through legal process, not violence. Vikings had laws against excessive violence even during raids. Leaders who allowed their men to run completely wild risked losing control and facing rebellion. Women in Viking expeditions complicate the pillaging narrative. Recent DNA analysis shows that Viking settlements often included substantial numbers of women from Scandinavia. These weren't just raiders grabbing local wives. Families were migrating together. Women brought household goods, cultural practices and stability. It's hard to maintain the image of Vikings as ravaging hordes when they're travelling with their wives and children. The slave trade, while undeniably part of Viking economy, was more complex than simple raiding for human chattels. Many slaves were captured in raids, but others were debtors, criminals, or people who sold themselves into slavery during famines. Vikings also bought slaves from other cultures and sold them across their trade networks. The slave trade was brutal, but it was a brutal system that existed throughout medieval Europe, not a unique Viking evil. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows remarkable cultural exchange rather than domination. Viking sites contain Islamic coins, Byzantine silks, Frankish weapons, and Irish artwork. This isn't the detritus of pillaging, but evidence of extensive trade networks and cultural appreciation. Vikings weren't just taking, they were buying, selling, and exchanging ideas and technologies. The Norman conquest of England in 1066, led by descendants of Vikings, shows how quickly pillagers became sophisticated state builders. Within a few generations, Norse raiders had become French nobility, creating one of the most organised and efficient kingdoms in medieval Europe. The Normans built castles, established laws, and created administrative systems that lasted centuries. The transformation from raider to ruler was remarkably quick. In Iceland, Vikings created one of the most peaceful societies in medieval Europe. With no external enemies and few internal conflicts, Icelanders focused on law, literature, and trade. They produced more literature per capita than any other medieval society. The Icelandic sagas, our main source for Viking culture, were written by the descendants of supposed pillagers who had become sophisticated authors and poets. The Rus Vikings, who founded the Russian state, were invited by Slavic tribes who needed their military and organizational expertise. According to the Russian primary chronicle, the Slavs said to the Vikings, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us. This isn't conquest, it's a job interview." The Vikings became the ruling class not through pillaging, but through invitation and integration. The economic impact of Viking trade versus Viking raiding tells an interesting story. Raiding was high risk, high reward, but ultimately unsustainable. You could only raid a monastery once before it either improved its defences or ran out of gold. Trade, however, was renewable. A successful trade relationship could last generations, creating far more wealth than any single raid. Smart Vikings figured this out quickly. Even the fearsome Viking weapons tell a more complex story. Yes, they had excellent swords and axes, but these were often traded rather than used. A Viking sword was a luxury item, worth a small fortune. Many Vikings made their wealth selling weapons to other cultures rather than using them. The idea that every Viking was armed to the teeth ignores economic reality. Iron was expensive, and most Vikings couldn't afford military equipment. When people think of Viking transportation, they picture one thing: dragon-headed longships cutting through storm-tossed seas, packed with bearded warriors ready for battle. While longships were indeed remarkable achievements, reducing Viking maritime culture to these warships alone is like saying modern naval power consists only of aircraft carriers. Vikings built a diverse fleet of specialised vessels, from tiny fishing boats to massive cargo ships, and their true genius lay not in the dragons carved on the prows, but in their revolutionary understanding of naval architecture. The Viking longship, or drakkar, was undeniably impressive. Sleek, shallow-drafted, and incredibly fast. These ships could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. They could be sailed or rowed, beached easily, and even carried over land between waterways. The combination of flexibility and speed made them perfect for raiding, allowing Vikings to appear suddenly where no one expected seaborne attackers. But here's what nobody mentions. Longships were probably a minority of Viking vessels. Most Viking ships were nars, cargo vessels designed for trade, not war. These were the workhorses of the Viking economy, broader and deeper than longships, with large holds for cargo. A typical nar could carry 24 tons of goods, equivalent to dozens of wagon loads. These weren't sexy or dramatic, but they were the vessels that actually built Viking prosperity. For every longship carrying raiders, there were probably several nars carrying merchants. The diversity of Viking vessels was staggering. They built fishing boats for coastal waters, ferries for river crossings, and specialised ships for whaling. They had different designs for different seas. Ships built for the North Atlantic were different from those used in the Baltic, or for river navigation in Russia. This wasn't one-size-fits-all shipbuilding, but sophisticated naval architecture adapted to specific needs. The technology behind Viking ships was revolutionary. Their clinker-built construction with overlapping planks created flexible hulls that could withstand the stress of ocean waves. While other cultures built rigid ships that fought the sea, Viking ships flexed with it. Watching a Viking ship in heavy seas was like watching it breathe, the entire structure moving organically with the water. The Viking sail was equally innovative. Made from wool, often reinforced with leather strips, these sails were works of art and engineering. They could be reefed, reduced in size, quickly in changing winds, and their square shape, while simple, was remarkably efficient. Vikings understood wind patterns and could sail closer to the wind than most contemporary vessels. They weren't just muscle-powered rowing machines, but sophisticated sailing vessels. Navigation techniques reveal Viking maritime genius. Without compasses, they navigated using sun compasses, stars, and natural phenomena. They could read wave patterns, bird behaviour, and cloud formations. They used crystal sunstones to locate the sun through clouds, a technique so advanced that researchers only recently figured out how it worked. Viking navigators could find tiny islands in vast oceans, a skill that seems almost magical. The dragon heads everyone associates with Viking ships were actually removable and relatively rare. They were ceremonial, attached for special occasions or to intimidate enemies. Most Viking ships probably sailed without any decorative prow at all. The dragons were psychological warfare, not standard equipment. It's like assuming all modern military vehicles have shark teeth painted on them, because some fighter planes do. Viking shipbuilding was a communal effort that reveals much about their society. Building a longship required enormous resources, hundreds of trees, thousands of iron rivets, miles of rope, and months of skilled labour. Communities invested together in ships, sharing costs and profits. Ship ownership was often collective, with multiple families owning shares. This wasn't the work of individual warlords, but entire communities working together. The preservation of Viking ships in burials shows their cultural importance beyond mere transportation. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships, buried with their wealthy owners, weren't just vehicles but symbols of power, wealth, and possibly spiritual vessels for the afterlife journey. The resources devoted to ship burials, essentially throwing away a valuable ship, shows these vessels meant more than their practical value. Viking ships enabled exploration on a scale unmatched in medieval Europe. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus, established settlements in Greenland, and explored the Mediterranean and Black Seas. They navigated Russian rivers to reach the Caspian Sea, possibly travelling as far as Baghdad. This wasn't random wandering, but systematic exploration, often following trade routes and seeking new opportunities. The influence of Viking shipbuilding lasted centuries. The cog, the dominant medieval cargo ship, incorporated Viking innovations. The English Navy adopted Viking ship designs and techniques. Even today, traditional boat builders in Scandinavia use methods descended from Viking techniques. the clinker-built construction method survived into the 20th century for small boats. Women and ships had a special relationship in Viking culture often overlooked by the masculine raiding narrative. Ships were grammatically feminine in Old Norse. Women often owned ships or shares in ships. They sponsored ship construction and managed shipping businesses while men were away. The Osberg ship was buried with 2 women, suggesting women could be significant ship owners. The seasonal nature of Viking sailing contradicts the image of constant raiding. Ships were typically launched in late spring, after planting, and returned by autumn harvest. Winter sailing was dangerous and rare. Most Vikings spent more time maintaining and repairing ships than sailing them. The dramatic sea voyage was a small part of a yearly cycle, dominated by agriculture and craftsmanship. Shipbuilding locations tell us about Viking resource management and trade. Ships were built where suitable timber was available, particularly oak for keels and frames. Shipbuilding centres developed specialised economies, with entire communities devoted to producing ships and naval supplies. The Roskilde shipyard in Denmark could produce multiple ships simultaneously, operating almost like a medieval factory. Here's something that shatters the traditional Viking narrative. By the end of the Viking Age, many Vikings weren't Scandinavian at all. The popular image of Vikings as exclusively blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norsemen ignores the complex reality of a multicultural society that absorbed people from Ireland to Russia, from Greenland to Constantinople. Viking was a job description, not an ethnicity, and Viking crews often looked like medieval United Nations assemblies. DNA analysis of Viking Age burials has revealed stunning diversity. Graves in Scandinavia containing Viking grave goods and weapons have yielded DNA from people of Irish, Scottish, Slavic, and even Southern European ancestry. The famous Viking cemetery at Repton in England included individuals of North African ancestry. These weren't captives or slaves buried with Viking honours. They were full members of Viking society. The Viking expansion created a massive mixing pot. When Vikings settled in Ireland, they didn't remain separate from the Irish population. They intermarried extensively. Within a generation, you had Gaul Gaels, foreign Gaels, people of mixed Norse-Irish ancestry who were culturally both Viking and Celtic. These hybrid populations often became more successful than either parent culture, combining Viking maritime skills with local knowledge. In Russia, the situation was even more complex. The Rus Vikings, who gave Russia its name, were a tiny minority ruling over a vast Slavic population. Within a few generations, they were essentially Slavic themselves, having adopted local language, customs, and religion. By the time of the Kievan Rus's height, determining who was Viking and who was Slavic had become impossible and irrelevant. The Varangian Guard, the Byzantine Empire's elite Viking unit, recruited from across the Viking diaspora. You had Swedes serving alongside Norwegians, Danes, Icelanders, Anglo-Danes from England, Rus from Kiev, and eventually even Anglo-Saxons fleeing Norman conquest. They communicated in a pidgin of Old Norse, Greek, and whatever else worked. This elite Viking unit was about as ethnically pure as a New York subway car. Iceland, supposedly the most pure Viking society, was surprisingly diverse from the start. While the leading families were Norwegian, they brought Irish and Scottish slaves and wives. DNA studies show modern Icelanders have substantial Celtic ancestry, particularly through the female line. The founding population of Iceland was already mixed, and that's before considering later immigrants from other parts of Scandinavia and Europe. The concept of becoming Viking was apparently open to anyone with the right skills and attitude. Sagas mentioned Sami Vikings, Finnish Vikings, and even Saxon Vikings. If you could sail, fight, and contribute to an expedition, your ancestry mattered less than your ability. The meritocratic aspect of Viking culture, unusual for medieval Europe, allowed talented outsiders to rise high in Viking society. Language provides more evidence of Viking multiculturalism. Old Norse absorbed words from every culture Vikings contacted. They borrowed military terms from Frankish, trading terms from Slavic, and luxury words from Latin and Greek. English contributed hundreds of words to Old Norse, just as Old Norse contributed to English. This wasn't one-way cultural domination, but mutual exchange. The slave-to-Viking pipeline was surprisingly common. Slaves who proved themselves could be freed and even adopted into families. Their children were fully free and could participate in Viking expeditions. Within a generation or two, the descendants of Irish slaves might be leading Viking raids on Ireland. The fluidity of status in Viking society was remarkable for its time. Religious conversion added another layer of complexity. Christian Vikings maintained their Viking identity while practicing a new religion. Muslim Vikings served in the armies of Islamic Spain. Some Vikings simultaneously practiced Norse paganism and Christianity, hedging their spiritual bets. Religious identity and cultural identity were separate, allowing Vikings to adapt to local conditions while maintaining their Viking connections. The clothing and material culture of Viking Age Scandinavia shows extensive foreign influence. Byzantine silks, Islamic coins, Frankish weapons and Irish brooches appear throughout Viking territories. This wasn't just loot, but evidence of Vikings adopting foreign fashions and technologies. A typical Viking warrior might wear Frankish mail, carry an English sword, and decorate himself with Islamic silver. Trade networks created Viking communities far from Scandinavia. Viking traders settled permanently in Constantinople, Kiev, York, and Dublin. These expatriate Vikings maintained connections to Scandinavia while becoming essentially local. Their children might never see Scandinavia, but still considered themselves Vikings. Viking identity became portable, something you could carry anywhere. Women's roles in creating multicultural Viking societies are often overlooked. Viking men often married local women when settling new lands, but Viking women also travelled and intermarried. A Swedish woman might marry an Irish-Norse trader in Dublin, move to Iceland, and raise children who were culturally Viking but ethnically mixed. These women were cultural bridges, maintaining Viking traditions while adapting to new environments. The Norman example perfectly illustrates Viking adaptability. Within 150 years, Vikings in Normandy had become completely French in language and culture, while maintaining their military prowess and adventurous spirit. They then conquered England, Sicily, and parts of the Middle East. Were the Normans still Vikings? They certainly thought so when it suited them, claiming Viking ancestry when recruiting Scandinavian mercenaries. The stereotype of Vikings as technological primitives using crude weapons and simple tools falls apart the moment you examine actual Viking artifacts. These supposedly backward people were creating pattern-welded steel that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries, navigating with sophisticated instruments and building architectural marvels that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Viking technology wasn't primitive. It was often more advanced than their contemporaries, just different from our expectations of what advanced should look like. Let's talk about Viking steel, specifically their legendary swords. Vikings created pattern-welded blades, often called Damascus steel, though technically different, that combined multiple types of steel and iron to create blades of extraordinary quality. The patterns weren't just decorative. They represented sophisticated metallurgy that created flexible, sharp, and durable weapons. These swords were so valued that they had names and genealogies passed down through generations like royal titles. The Ulfbert swords represent the pinnacle of Viking metallurgy. These blades, marked with the mysterious Ulfbert inscription, were made from crucible steel with almost no slag content, a purity that wouldn't be achieved again in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. Modern metallurgists attempting to recreate these swords have struggled to match their quality using traditional methods. These weren't primitive weapons but high technology, the medieval equivalent of precision engineering. Viking jewellery and decorative metalwork reveal sophisticated techniques including granulation, decorating with tiny gold spheres, filigree, intricate wirework, and niello, black metallic inlay. They created complex brooches with internal spring mechanisms, chainmail so fine it looked like fabric, and goldwork that required magnification to fully appreciate. This wasn't crude hammering, but precision craftsmanship requiring years of training and sophisticated tools. The Vikings' understanding of acoustics and architecture was remarkable. Their longhouses weren't just big barns, but carefully designed structures with excellent acoustics for storytelling and music. Some Viking-age churches in Norway show sophisticated understanding of sound propagation, with wooden construction that creates near-perfect acoustical environments. They understood principles of resonance and sound reflection that wouldn't be formally described for centuries. Viking textile technology is criminally underrated. They created sails strong enough to withstand North Atlantic storms, using sophisticated weaving techniques that distributed stress evenly across the fabric. Their clothing wasn't rough homespun, but often featured complex patterns, multiple colours, and innovative construction techniques. They developed waterproofing methods using fish oil and other treatments that kept clothing functional in harsh conditions. The navigational instruments Vikings used seem almost impossibly advanced for their time. The sun compass, a wooden disc with notches and a central gnomon, allowed precise navigation even in the Arctic where magnetic compasses fail. The sunstone, probably a crystal of Iceland spar, could locate the sun through heavy cloud cover by detecting polarized light. These weren't primitive tools, but sophisticated instruments based on deep understanding of natural phenomena. Viking agricultural technology was innovative and adapted to harsh northern conditions. They developed new ploughing techniques for rocky soil, created efficient irrigation systems, and pioneered crop rotation methods that maintained soil fertility. Their iron ploughshares and agricultural tools were often superior to those used in more civilized parts of Europe. They even developed specialized tools for specific soils and conditions. The preservation techniques Vikings used for food were sophisticated and effective. They understood smoking, salting, fermentation, and drying methods that kept food edible for months or years. Skyr, a dairy product still made in Iceland, represents a complex understanding of controlled fermentation. Their pickled and preserved foods allowed long ocean voyages and survival through harsh winters. Viking locks and keys show unexpected mechanical sophistication. They created complex padlocks with internal spring mechanisms, puzzle locks that required specific sequences to open, and keys so intricate they doubled as jewellery. These weren't simple bolts, but mechanical devices that wouldn't look out of place in much later periods. Some Viking locks are so complex that modern locksmiths struggle to understand their mechanisms. The construction techniques used in Viking ships reveal engineering genius. They understood concepts like length-to-beam ratios, centre of gravity, and hydrodynamic efficiency. Their use of naturally curved timber for specific ship parts showed understanding of wood grain and structural stress. The flexibility built into their ships, allowing them to flex rather than break in heavy seas, represents sophisticated engineering that rigid construction methods couldn't achieve. Viking glassmaking, while not as famous as their metalwork, was surprisingly advanced. They created glass beads using complex techniques including millefiori, thousand flowers, patterns that required precise temperature control and timing. They recycled Roman glass, remelting and reshaping ancient materials with techniques that preserved the glass quality. Some Viking glass shows evidence of deliberate chemical manipulation to achieve specific colours. Medical technology in Viking society was more advanced than often portrayed. They performed successful surgeries, including trepanation, skull surgery, setting complex fractures, and even dental work. Surgical instruments found in Viking contexts show sophisticated design for specific procedures. They understood wound care, using honey as an antiseptic and specific herbs for pain relief and healing. The Viking understanding of chemistry, while not formalized, was practical and effective. They knew how to extract iron from bog ore, create different types of steel through carbon manipulation, produce various dyes from plants and minerals, and create effective preservatives and treatments for materials. Their soap making using ash and animal fats produced cleansers that were both effective and mild enough for regular use. Communication technology included not just runic writing, but sophisticated systems of beacons, horns, and signals that could transmit messages across long distances quickly. The Viking beacon system in Norway could allegedly transmit a signal the length of the country in hours. They also used trained birds for communication, a practice requiring understanding of animal behaviour and navigation. Perhaps no aspect of Viking society has been more misrepresented than the status of women. Popular culture typically presents Viking women as either helpless victims or fantasy shield maidens, both extremes missing the complex reality. Viking-age Scandinavian women enjoyed legal rights, economic power, and social freedoms that wouldn't appear in most of Europe for another 1,000 years. While they certainly faced restrictions and inequalities, Viking women were far from the powerless property that stereotypes suggest. Let's start with property rights, ironically enough. Viking women could own land in their own names, something almost unheard of in medieval Europe. They could inherit equally with their brothers in many circumstances, manage estates independently, and pass property to their children. Widows often became powerful landowners, controlling significant wealth and wielding considerable political influence. The idea that Viking women were property is laughable when they were some of the biggest property owners in their society. The keys hanging from a married woman's belt weren't just symbolic, they represented real authority. The housewife, husfreyja, literally lady of the house, controlled all domestic affairs, including household finances, food storage, and servant management. In a society where the household was the basic economic unit, this made women essential economic managers. When men went on expeditions, women ran entire estates, sometimes for years. Divorce in Viking society was remarkably straightforward for women. A woman could divorce her husband for various reasons, including violence, economic failure, or even sexual incompetence. The process was simple. She called witnesses and declared herself divorced. She retained her dowry, her personal property, and often received additional compensation. Compare this to medieval Christian Europe, where divorce was essentially impossible, and Viking women look remarkably liberated. The concept of morning gift, morgengifu, protected women economically. After consummating a marriage, the husband gave his wife a substantial gift, often land or valuable goods, that became her personal property. This wasn't part of the dowry that might return to her family, but her own wealth that she controlled absolutely. It provided economic security and independence within marriage. Women in Viking society could conduct business independently. They could buy and sell property, make contracts, and represent themselves in legal proceedings. Female merchants appear in historical records, particularly in textile trade. Some women became wealthy traders, owning ships and funding expeditions. The stereotype of Vikings as exclusively male traders ignores the archaeological evidence of female merchants buried with scales and weights. The legal system provided surprising protections for women. Rape was punishable by outlawry, essentially a death sentence. Violence against women, even by husbands, could result in severe legal consequences. Women could serve as witnesses in court, bring lawsuits, and even act as legal advocates for others. While not equal to men legally, Viking women had more legal standing than women in most contemporary societies. Female religious practitioners held significant power in Viking society. Völvers, seeresses, were respected and feared, travelling between communities to perform rituals and prophecy. They commanded high prices for their services and could refuse or curse even powerful chiefs. The goddess Freyja was as important as Odin in many regions, and her priestesses wielded considerable influence. This religious authority translated into real social power. The textile industry, dominated by women, was crucial to Viking economy. Women didn't just make clothes for their families, they produced trade goods that were exported across Europe. Wadmal, a woolen cloth, was so economically important it was used as currency in Iceland. Women who controlled textile production controlled a significant portion of the economy. The image of Viking women as mere domestic servants ignores their role as industrial producers. Archaeological evidence reveals women participating in colonization and exploration. DNA analysis of Viking age burials in England, Ireland and Iceland shows substantial numbers of Scandinavian women among the settlers. These weren't women captured after raids, but voluntary colonists who chose to leave Scandinavia. The idea that Viking expansion was purely male ignores the families who built new societies together. Women warriors, while controversial, have archaeological support. The Birka warrior burial, initially assumed male because of weapons, was revealed through DNA analysis to be female. While this doesn't prove widespread female combat participation, it suggests some women did fight. More commonly, women defended settlements when men were away, and sagas describe women taking revenge for killed relatives. The Shield Maiden might be rare, but she wasn't pure fantasy. Educational opportunities for Viking women exceeded European norms. While most were illiterate, wealthy women often learned to read runes and sometimes Latin. They composed and memorized poetry, essential in oral culture. Some women became renowned poets whose work survives in sagas. The idea that Viking women were uneducated ignores their role in preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. The concubine system, while exploitative, was more complex than simple sexual slavery. Many concubines were temporary wives who received legal recognition, and whose children had inheritance rights. Some concubines became powerful figures, essentially common law wives with significant influence. While certainly not ideal from a modern perspective, the system provided more protection and opportunity than complete exclusion from society. Women's role in death and burial reveals their social importance. Wealthy women received elaborate burials equal to men, with ships, sacrifices, and grave goods indicating high status. The Osberg ship burial contained 2 women with extraordinary wealth, suggesting female political or religious leadership. Women also controlled burial rites, determining how the dead were honoured and remembered. The conversion to Christianity actually reduced women's rights in Scandinavia. Christian law removed women's right to divorce, eliminated female religious authority, and restricted property rights. Viking-age women lost freedoms their pagan grandmothers had enjoyed. The supposedly civilizing influence of Christianity was, for Scandinavian women, a step backward. The popular image of Viking feasting involves massive haunches of meat, drinking horns overflowing with mead, and not much else. This carnivorous caricature ignores the sophisticated and varied diet that actually sustained Viking society. Vikings were omnivores with a complex food culture that included everything from fermented fish to imported spices, and their understanding of nutrition and food preservation was remarkably advanced. The real Viking diet was both more diverse and more interesting than the stereotype suggests. Let's start with the obvious. Most Vikings couldn't afford to eat meat every day. Meat was valuable, especially in winter when keeping livestock alive required precious fodder. The average Viking family ate meat perhaps once or twice a week, usually preserved rather than fresh. The image of Vikings constantly gnawing on legs of mutton comes from descriptions of special feasts, not daily meals. It's like assuming modern Americans eat Thanksgiving dinner every day. The staple of Viking diet was actually grain: barley, rye, and oats. They made various types of bread, from fine wheat bread for the wealthy to dense, dark rye bread for everyone else. Porridge was eaten daily, flavoured with butter, herbs, or honey when available. Grains were also malted for brewing and fermented for preservation. The Viking dependence on agriculture is conveniently forgotten in favour of the raiding narrative. Fish was probably more important than meat in most Viking diets. Living near coasts, rivers, and lakes, Vikings had access to abundant seafood. They ate cod, herring, salmon, trout, and shellfish. More importantly, they developed sophisticated preservation methods, drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting, that turned fish into a trade commodity. Stockfish, dried cod, became so important it was practically currency in some regions. Dairy products were crucial to Viking nutrition. They made various cheeses, from fresh curds to aged hard cheeses that could last months. Skyr, still popular in Iceland, was a protein-rich dairy product similar to yogurt. Butter was so valuable it was buried in bogs for preservation and aging. They even made a type of cheese from reindeer milk in the far north. The Viking dairy industry was sophisticated and essential to survival. Vegetables played a larger role than most people realise. Vikings grew and ate cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, carrots, beans, and peas. They collected wild garlic, mushrooms, and various herbs. Kale was so important that specialised kale gardens, Kallgarder, were legally protected spaces. The image of Vikings as pure carnivores ignores archaeological evidence of extensive vegetable cultivation and storage. Fruits, both cultivated and wild, supplemented Viking diets. They grew apples and possibly pears, collected wild berries, nuts, and rose hips. Fruit was dried for preservation, made into conserves with honey, or fermented into alcohol. Hazelnuts were particularly important, providing protein and oil. The Viking sweet tooth was satisfied with honey-preserved fruits and berries, not just mead. The beverage situation was far more complex than mead all the time. Most Vikings drank ale daily. Water was often unsafe, and weak ale was the standard drink for all ages. Mead, made from honey, was expensive and reserved for special occasions. Wine was imported and highly prized. They also made various fruit wines and fermented drinks from birch sap, whey, and other sources. The Viking drinking culture was diverse and sophisticated. Spices and seasonings show Viking trade connections and culinary sophistication. They used native herbs like dill, mustard, horseradish, and juniper, but also imported black pepper, cumin, and other exotic spices through their trade networks. Salt was crucial not just for preservation but for flavouring. The idea that Viking food was bland ignores evidence of complex seasoning and flavour preferences. Food preparation methods were surprisingly sophisticated. Vikings boiled, roasted, baked, smoked, and even made primitive pressure cooking using heated stones in sealed pits. They had specialised cooking equipment including iron cauldrons, soapstone vessels, and ceramic pots. Bread ovens were communal resources showing organised food production. The technology of Viking cooking was far from primitive. Seasonal eating patterns shaped Viking culture profoundly. Summer meant fresh vegetables, dairy, and occasional fresh meat. Autumn was preservation time. Smoking, salting, drying, and fermenting for winter storage. Winter relied on preserved foods, root vegetables, and careful rationing. Spring was often the hungriest time when stores ran low before new crops arrived. This seasonal cycle influenced everything from raid timing to religious festivals. The social aspects of Viking food culture were complex and important. Feasts weren't just about consumption, but about displaying wealth, building alliances, and reinforcing social bonds. The position at a feast table indicated status. Gift-giving of food, especially rare delicacies, created obligations and relationships. Food was politics, diplomacy, and social currency rolled into one. Trade goods reveal Viking culinary ambitions. They imported wine from France, wheat from England, and honey from Eastern Europe. Exotic foods like walnuts made their way to Scandinavia through Viking trade routes. The effort and expense involved in obtaining foreign foods shows that Vikings cared deeply about dietary variety and quality. They weren't content with local fare, but sought out new flavours and ingredients. Food taboos and preferences varied regionally and culturally. Horse meat was eaten in some areas but taboo in others, especially after Christian conversion. Certain fish were considered poor people's food while others were delicacies. Food choices marked identity. What you ate showed who you were, where you came from, and what you could afford. The Viking relationship with food was deeply cultural, not just nutritional. The archaeological record of Viking food is remarkably rich. Preserved stomach contents, latrine deposits, and food residues on pottery tell detailed stories about diet. Isotope analysis of bones reveals what people ate throughout their lives. This scientific evidence consistently shows diverse, varied diets that change seasonally and regionally. The monotonous meat and mead stereotype crumbles under archaeological scrutiny. The image of Vikings as perpetual warriors, constantly fighting and raiding, ignores the mathematical impossibility of such a lifestyle. Constant warfare would have destroyed Viking society within a generation. You can't farm, trade, craft, or raise families if everyone is always fighting. The reality is that most Vikings lived remarkably peaceful lives, punctuated by occasional violence that was often defensive rather than aggressive. Even professional warriors spent more time training, travelling, and negotiating than actually fighting. Let's do some basic math. The Viking Age lasted roughly 300 years, 793 to 1066 CE. If we catalogue every recorded Viking raid, battle and conflict, we get perhaps a few thousand violent events, spread across 3 centuries and hundreds of thousands of people, that averages out to most Vikings never participating in violence at all. The perception of constant warfare comes from historical sources that only recorded exceptional events, not normal life. The agricultural calendar dictated Viking activity more than bloodlust. Planting happened in spring, harvest in autumn. These were non-negotiable if you wanted to survive winter. Raiding, when it occurred, fit between agricultural seasons. Most expeditions lasted weeks or months, not years. The idea of Vikings perpetually away on raids ignores the basic requirement of food production. Someone had to stay home and farm, and that someone was usually most of the population. Viking society's legal system actively discouraged violence. The Thing, assembly, spent most of its time preventing or resolving conflicts, not celebrating them. Blood feuds were seen as destructive and were actively mediated. Compensation, Bergild, was preferred to revenge. A society supposedly obsessed with violence had remarkably sophisticated mechanisms for avoiding it. The sagas present violence as tragedy, not triumph. Trade occupied far more Viking time than raiding. For every Viking who went raiding, dozens went trading. The archaeological record is dominated by trade goods, not weapons. Viking towns like Birka, Hedeby, and Kaupang were commercial centres, not military bases. The infrastructure of Viking society, roads, bridges, ports, was built for commerce, not conquest. The peaceful trader was the typical Viking. not the exceptional one. The seasonal nature of Viking conflict reveals its limited scope. Battles typically occurred in summer when weather permitted travel and armies could live off the land. Winter warfare was rare and usually defensive. This seasonal pattern meant that even in years with conflicts, actual fighting occupied perhaps a few weeks. The rest of the year was peaceful by necessity. Viking fortifications tell an interesting story. Many were designed for refuge, not aggression, places where civilians could shelter during attacks. The resources invested in defensive structures often exceeded those spent on offensive capabilities. This is not the pattern of a society devoted to constant aggression, but one trying to protect itself from violence, including other Vikings. The demographics of Viking society make constant warfare impossible. Children, elderly, women who didn't fight, and the disabled comprised most of the population. These people needed protection and support, not constant conflict. A society at permanent war can't maintain the vulnerable populations that Viking society clearly supported. The existence of elaborate elder care and child-rearing practices proves peaceful intervals dominated. Professional warriors, even the famous Viking raiders, spent surprisingly little time fighting. Travel to and from raid sites took weeks or months. Negotiations often preceded and followed violence. Winter quarters required peaceful interaction with local populations. Even berserkers couldn't berserk constantly. The human body simply can't maintain that level of activity. The logistics of warfare forced long, peaceful intervals. Viking expansion often occurred through peaceful settlement rather than conquest. Iceland was uninhabited when Vikings arrived. The Faroe Islands had only Irish monks. Much of northern Scotland was sparsely populated. Vikings often settled in areas that avoided conflict rather than sought it. The pattern of settlement shows preference for empty or weakly defended lands, not constant aggressive expansion. Internal conflicts in Scandinavia were often resolved through law rather than war. While civil wars occurred, they were exceptional events that disrupted normal life. Most succession disputes were settled through negotiation or single combat rather than mass warfare. The Thing system provided alternatives to violence that were usually preferred. Even ambitious leaders understood that constant warfare would destroy the economic base of their power. The role of women in maintaining peace is underappreciated. Women often acted as peace weavers, marrying between hostile groups to create alliances. They maintained households during men's absences, ensuring economic continuity. They raised children with values beyond warfare. The stable, peaceful domestic sphere that women maintained was essential to Viking society's survival. Religious practices emphasized peace as much as war. While Odin was associated with war, gods like Balder represented peace and justice. Festivals celebrated harvest and fertility more often than victory. Religious sites were often sanctuaries where violence was forbidden. The spiritual life of Vikings included significant peaceful elements, ignored by the warrior-obsessed narrative. The economic cost of warfare limited its frequency. Weapons and armor were expensive. Ships required massive investment. Feeding an army was enormously costly. Lost agricultural labor during campaigns meant reduced harvests. Vikings were rational economic actors who understood that constant warfare would impoverish everyone. Peace was usually more profitable than war. The stereotype of Vikings as intellectually primitive brutes who solved every problem with an axe couldn't be further from the truth. These were people who created one of the world's great literary traditions, developed sophisticated legal systems, pioneered new navigational techniques, and produced poetry so complex that modern scholars still struggle to fully understand it. The Viking Age was as much an intellectual flowering as a military expansion, though the brainy achievements get far less attention than the bloody battles. The Icelandic sagas represent one of medieval Europe's greatest literary achievements. These weren't simple adventure stories, but complex narratives exploring themes of honour, fate, family, and justice. The psychological depth of saga characters rivals modern literature. Egil's saga presents a warrior poet whose verses are as deadly as his sword. Njal's saga examines legal philosophy and moral complexity with sophistication that wouldn't appear in European literature for centuries. Viking poetry was incredibly complex, using forms like drotkvet that required mastery of alliteration, internal rhyme, and elaborate metaphorical language called kennings. A sword might be called wound snake or battle flame. The sea could be whale road, or swan's path. Creating these kennings required deep cultural knowledge, linguistic skill, and creative intelligence. Viking poets, skalds, were intellectuals who spent years perfecting their craft, memorizing thousands of verses and creating new compositions on demand. The legal complexity of Viking society reveals sophisticated thinking about justice, property, and social organization. The Gragaas, Iceland's medieval law code, contains detailed provisions for everything from beekeeping rights to water management. Viking law distinguished between intentional and accidental harm, included concepts like statutes of limitations, and had elaborate procedures for evidence evaluation. This wasn't primitive might makes right, but complex jurisprudence. Viking navigation required advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge. They understood celestial navigation, reading stars, sun positions, and even wave patterns to find their way across open ocean. The solar compass they invented required understanding of geometry and solar angles. Their ability to repeatedly find tiny islands in vast oceans suggests navigation methods we're still trying to fully understand. These weren't lucky guesses, but systematic techniques based on careful observation and calculation. The runic alphabet shows linguistic sophistication often overlooked. Vikings didn't just copy Latin letters, but created their own writing system adapted to carving in wood and stone. They understood that different materials required different scripts. The younger Futhark actually simplified the elder Futhark, showing deliberate linguistic reform. This wasn't primitive picture writing, but a sophisticated phonetic system that evolved with the language. Viking medicine, while not modern, showed systematic thinking about health and healing. They performed successful surgeries, understood the basics of wound infection, and used herbs with genuine medicinal properties. The sagas describe diagnostic procedures, surgical techniques, and post-operative care that show medical knowledge beyond mere superstition. They even understood the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection, centuries before germ theory. Mathematical knowledge among Vikings extended beyond basic counting. They used sophisticated systems for land measurement, understood complex fractions for inheritance division, and calculated compound interest on loans. Their shipbuilding required precise mathematical calculations for hull proportions. The geometry of their buildings shows understanding of structural engineering principles. This mathematical literacy was widespread enough that ordinary farmers could participate in complex legal proceedings involving numerical calculations. The strategic intelligence of Viking military operations contradicts the mindless brute stereotype. They gathered intelligence before raids, used deception and misdirection, and adapted tactics to local conditions. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 showed strategic planning worthy of any military academy. They understood logistics, supply lines, and the importance of local political divisions. Their success came from intelligence, not just strength. Viking art reveals sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities and symbolic thinking. The intricate interlacing patterns in Viking art aren't random, but follow complex mathematical rules. Their animal styles encode cultural meanings that scholars still debate. The picture stones of Gotland tell complex narratives requiring visual literacy to decode. This wasn't crude decoration, but sophisticated visual communication. The economic thinking of Vikings shows financial sophistication. They understood currency exchange rates, engaged in complex credit arrangements, and developed international trade protocols. They created some of Europe's first commercial law codes. Their understanding of supply and demand led them to corner markets in specific goods. The stereotype of Vikings as simple raiders ignores their role as medieval Europe's venture capitalists. Educational practices in Viking society, while different from formal schooling, were remarkably effective. Young Vikings memorized vast amounts of poetry, law, and genealogy. They learned multiple crafts, languages, and navigation techniques. The fact that Iceland, settled by Vikings, achieved nearly universal literacy by the medieval period suggests strong educational traditions. This wasn't a society that devalued learning, but one that transmitted knowledge effectively across generations. Viking diplomacy shows political sophistication usually ignored in favour of battle narratives. They negotiated complex treaties, arranged dynastic marriages, and played European powers against each other brilliantly. Viking leaders often spoke multiple languages and understood foreign customs. Their diplomatic successes, like the establishment of the Danelaw through negotiation rather than conquest, show intelligence beyond mere military might. The philosophical dimensions of Viking thought appear in their literature and religious concepts. The idea of weird, fate, involved complex thinking about free will versus determinism. Their cosmology, with its multiple worlds and complex relationships between gods and giants, shows abstract thinking about order and chaos. The concept of Ragnarok as cyclic destruction and rebirth reveals sophisticated philosophical speculation about time and existence. Archaeological evidence consistently shows Vikings as innovators and adapters. They quickly adopted useful technologies from other cultures: Arabic numerals, Christian architectural techniques, Byzantine military tactics. This intellectual flexibility, the ability to recognize and integrate superior ideas regardless of source, shows intelligence far beyond stubborn brutes. They were learners, constantly improving their knowledge and techniques. The reduction of Viking culture to warfare and raiding is perhaps the greatest injustice done to this remarkable civilization. Vikings created a rich cultural tapestry encompassing music, dance, games, sports, crafts, and social traditions that had nothing to do with violence. Their cultural achievements influenced European civilization for centuries, though credit is rarely given. The Vikings who spent their lives creating beauty, entertainment, and meaning far outnumbered those who wielded weapons. Music permeated Viking society at every level. They had a rich tradition of instruments including lyres, harps, flutes, horns, and drums. Archaeological finds include bone flutes carefully tuned to specific scales, suggesting sophisticated understanding of musical theory. Music accompanied work, worship, celebration, and mourning. The survival of traditional Scandinavian folk music shows continuous tradition stretching back to the Viking Age. These weren't tone-deaf brutes, but people who understood music's power to unite, inspire, and console. Dance was integral to Viking social life, though Christian chroniclers often disapproved of their lewd dances. Archaeological evidence of ankle bells and literary descriptions suggest elaborate group dances, possibly similar to modern folk dances still performed in Scandinavia. Dance served courtship, celebration, and religious purposes. The coordination required for group dances fostered social bonding and community identity beyond military brotherhood. Viking games and sports reveal a culture that valued play and competition beyond combat. They played board games like Tafel, a complex strategy game requiring forward thinking and tactical planning. Archaeological sites have yielded numerous gaming pieces, suggesting widespread popularity. Physical games included ball games, swimming competitions, and wrestling. These activities built community, resolved tensions peacefully, and provided entertainment during long winters. The storytelling tradition of Vikings created one of the world's great oral literatures. Long before sagas were written down, skalds memorized and performed thousands of verses. Storytelling wasn't passive entertainment but participatory art, with audiences expected to understand complex allusions and appreciate wordplay. The fact that illiterate societies maintained such elaborate oral traditions shows intellectual culture independent of written literature. Viking craftsmanship extended far beyond weapons into pure artistry. They carved elaborate wooden decorations, created intricate metalwork jewellery, and wove complex textiles. The Osberg ship's wood carvings show artistic skill equal to any medieval European art. These weren't just functional objects but expressions of aesthetic vision and cultural identity. The time invested in decorative arts shows a society that valued beauty for its own sake. Hospitality traditions in Viking culture were elaborate and important. The proper treatment of guests involved complex protocols, gift-giving, and reciprocal obligations. Feasts weren't just about food, but about reinforcing social bonds, displaying generosity, and creating alliances. The culture of hospitality created networks of mutual support that functioned like social insurance. This wasn't warrior culture, but sophisticated social organization. Religious festivals structured Viking yearly cycles with celebrations that had nothing to do with war. Yule celebrations lasted weeks, involving feasting, gift-giving, and rituals to ensure the sun's return. Spring festivals celebrated fertility and planting. Harvest festivals gave thanks for crops. These celebrations involved entire communities in music, dance, prayer, and social bonding. The richness of festival culture shows life concerned with prosperity and continuity, not just conflict. Viking humour and entertainment culture is preserved in sagas and archaeological finds. They enjoyed riddles, word games, and elaborate pranks. Flighting, competitive insulting in verse form required quick wit and linguistic skill. Comedic stories and satirical poems provided entertainment and social commentary. The fact that Vikings invested time in creating and preserving humour shows cultural priorities beyond grimness and violence. The textile arts, dominated by women, represented major cultural achievement. Viking Age textiles weren't just functional, but often beautiful, featuring complex patterns, multiple colours, and innovative techniques. Tapestries told stories, preserved history, and displayed wealth. The hours required to produce elaborate textiles show a society that valued artistic expression. These works were traded across Europe, spreading Viking aesthetic influence. Architecture beyond fortifications reveals Viking cultural ambitions. They built elaborate halls for feasting and assembly, not just defence. The stave churches of Norway, while Christian, incorporated Viking architectural traditions showing sophisticated understanding of wooden construction. Domestic architecture prioritised comfort and social space, not just shelter. The investment in civilian architecture shows cultural priorities beyond military needs. Personal ornamentation and fashion show Vikings as style-conscious, not just functional dresses. They wore elaborate brooches, arm rings, and necklaces that displayed wealth and taste. Clothing featured embroidery, tablet weaving, and imported fabrics. Hairstyles were elaborate and time-consuming to maintain. This attention to appearance shows cultural values emphasizing presentation and social display beyond warrior intimidation. The development of Old Norse as a literary language represents major cultural achievement. Vikings created vocabulary for abstract concepts, emotional states, and philosophical ideas. The richness of Old Norse poetry, with its complex metaphors and allusions, required linguistic sophistication from both creators and audiences. This wasn't a crude language of commands, but a flexible medium for expressing complex thoughts and feelings. Trade culture involved more than exchanging goods. Viking markets were social events featuring entertainment, matchmaking, and cultural exchange. Merchants needed cultural knowledge to succeed, understanding foreign customs, languages, and preferences. The cosmopolitan nature of Viking trade centres created multicultural environments where art, ideas, and technologies mixed. This cultural openness contradicts isolationist warrior stereotypes. One of the strangest myths about Vikings is that they somehow mysteriously disappeared, vanishing into the mists of history like some sort of medieval Atlantis. The reality is far less dramatic, but more interesting. Vikings didn't disappear, they evolved. They became the medieval kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They became the Normans who conquered England. They became the Rus who founded Russia. They became Icelanders who preserved their history in sagas. The Viking Age ended not with extinction but with transformation, and their descendants are very much still with us. The end of the Viking Age is traditionally dated to 1066, with the Battle of Stamford Bridge where Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking king, died attempting to conquer England. But this neat endpoint obscures the gradual transformation that had been occurring for centuries. Vikings didn't suddenly stop being Vikings on a specific date. They slowly became something else as their societies evolved and adapted to changing circumstances. Christianity played a major role in this transformation, but not through dramatic conversion battles between Thor and Christ. The Christianization of Scandinavia was a slow, often pragmatic process that took centuries. Many Vikings initially added Christ to their pantheon of gods rather than replacing the old gods entirely. Christian Vikings often maintained traditional practices with thin Christian veneers. The hammer of Thor morphed into the cross of Christ, but the underlying culture evolved rather than disappeared. Political centralization changed Viking society fundamentally. The petty kingdoms and loose confederations of the early Viking Age gradually consolidated into the medieval kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Professional armies replaced seasonal raiders. Royal administration replaced thing assemblies in many areas. Vikings became subjects of kings rather than free farmers who went raiding. The political structures that enabled Viking Age expeditions were replaced by different systems that didn't support the same activities. Economic changes made traditional Viking raiding obsolete. As European kingdoms developed better defences and professional armies, raiding became more dangerous and less profitable. Meanwhile, established trade routes and commercial law made peaceful trade more profitable than violent raiding. Vikings discovered they could make more money as merchants than as raiders. The economic incentive for Viking behaviour disappeared, so the behaviour changed. The Norse diaspora didn't vanish but integrated into local populations. Vikings in Ireland became Hiberno-Norse, then simply Irish. Vikings in England became Anglo-Danes, then English. Vikings in Normandy became Normans, then French. This wasn't disappearance but successful integration. DNA studies show that millions of people across Europe carry Viking ancestry, not through some mysterious disappearance, but through normal demographic mixing. Iceland represents Viking culture's continuation rather than disappearance. Settled primarily by Norwegian Vikings, Iceland maintained Old Norse language and traditions longer than Scandinavia itself. The Icelandic sagas, written centuries after the Viking Age, preserved Viking history and culture. Modern Icelandic is closer to Old Norse than modern Norwegian is. Iceland shows that Vikings didn't vanish. They evolved while maintaining core cultural elements. The Normans demonstrate Viking transformation rather than disappearance. Within 150 years of settling in France, Vikings had become French-speaking Catholics who conquered England, Sicily and parts of the Middle East. Yet they maintained Viking military prowess, adventurous spirit and organisational skills. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was essentially a Viking conquest by Vikings who had learned to speak French. The irony that 1066 marks both the end of the Viking Age and a Viking conquest of England is often missed. The Varangian Guard shows Vikings adapting to new contexts rather than disappearing. This elite Byzantine unit recruited Scandinavian warriors for centuries after the end of the Viking Age. They maintained Norse identity while serving Greek emperors. When Harald Hardrada left Byzantine service to become King of Norway, he brought Byzantine ideas and wealth back to Scandinavia. This cultural exchange shows Vikings as adaptable participants in medieval civilization, not vanishing primitives. Scandinavian society's evolution shows continuity beneath change. The things, assemblies, evolved into medieval parliaments. Viking law codes became the basis for medieval Scandinavian law. Agricultural practices, boat-building techniques, and craft traditions continued unbroken. The people didn't change, their circumstances did. A Norwegian farmer in 1100 was descended from Vikings, lived on the same land, and followed evolved versions of the same traditions. The linguistic legacy shows Viking influence persisting rather than vanishing. English contains hundreds of Norse loanwords that arrived during the Viking Age. Place names across Britain, Ireland and northern France preserve Old Norse elements. Days of the week in English still honour Norse gods. This linguistic DNA shows Vikings didn't disappear, they became part of the broader European linguistic landscape. Maritime traditions show remarkable continuity from Viking Age through medieval and into modern times. Scandinavian shipbuilding techniques evolved but maintained core Viking innovations. Coastal navigation methods persisted for centuries. The maritime focus of Scandinavian culture that enabled Viking expansion continued to define these societies. Modern Scandinavian shipping dominance has roots in Viking Age maritime expertise. The gradual nature of change is evident in archaeology. There's no clear break between Viking and medieval material culture. Styles evolved slowly, technologies developed incrementally, and practices changed gradually. The archaeological record shows transformation, not replacement. The same families lived in the same places, just with slowly changing material culture. Genetic studies definitively disprove the disappearance myth. Modern Scandinavians are directly descended from Viking Age populations. Moreover, Viking genetic markers appear throughout Europe, showing successful integration rather than disappearance. The British Isles, particularly Scotland and northern England, show substantial Scandinavian ancestry. Vikings didn't vanish. They became ancestors to millions of modern Europeans. The cultural impact persists in unexpected ways. Scandinavian concepts of individual rights, legal equality, and democratic governance influenced European political development. The Protestant Reformation found particularly fertile ground in Scandinavia, perhaps because of cultural values dating to the Viking Age. Modern Scandinavian social democracy, with its emphasis on equality and collective responsibility, echoes Viking Age thing assemblies. The portrayal of Viking paganism as primitive nature worship practiced by simple-minded heathens represents a fundamental misunderstanding of Norse religious complexity. Viking Age Scandinavians had sophisticated theological concepts, elaborate mythologies, a nuanced understanding of divinity that rivaled any contemporary religious system. Their gradual conversion to Christianity wasn't a triumph of civilization over barbarism, but a complex negotiation between two sophisticated religious traditions. The cosmology of Norse paganism was remarkably complex, featuring 9 worlds connected by Yggdrasil, the world tree. This wasn't primitive animism, but elaborate systematic theology. Each world had distinct characteristics, inhabitants, and relationships to others. The concept of multiple interconnected realities shows abstract thinking about existence and consciousness. Modern physicists' multiverse theories echo Norse cosmological complexity, though Vikings arrived there through mythology rather than mathematics. The notion of fate, wyrd or urlog in Norse thought, involved sophisticated philosophy about causation, free will, and destiny. The Norns, who wove fate, weren't simple fortune tellers, but complex representations of past, present, and future interconnection. Vikings understood that past actions constrained future possibilities, while still allowing individual agency. This nuanced view of determinism versus free will matches modern philosophical debates about causation and choice. Ragnarok, often simplified as Viking apocalypse, actually represented complex thinking about cycles, renewal, and cosmic justice. It wasn't just destruction, but transformation, the old world's end enabling a new world's beginning. Some gods survive, new ones emerge, and life continues transformed. This cyclical view of time and existence shows philosophical sophistication beyond simple linear thinking about beginnings and endings. The diversity of divine beings in Norse mythology reveals nuanced understanding of power, morality, and existence. Gods weren't simply good or evil, but complex beings with mixed motivations. Odin sought wisdom through suffering, sacrificing his eye and hanging himself. Loki was both problem causer and problem solver. This moral complexity shows sophisticated thinking about divine nature beyond simple dualistic good versus evil frameworks. Ritual practice in Norse paganism was elaborate and meaningful, not primitive superstition. Blot, sacrifice, involved complex protocols about what, when, where, and how to sacrifice. Different gods required different offerings for different purposes. The ritual calendar aligned with agricultural and astronomical cycles. This wasn't random superstition, but systematic religious practice based on generations of transmitted knowledge. Sacred spaces in Viking religion show sophisticated understanding of spiritual geography. Groves, springs, and mountains weren't randomly sacred, but chosen for specific qualities. The concept of vi, sacred enclosure, involved legal and spiritual boundaries. Some spaces were frithgarda, peace enclosures, where violence was forbidden. This sacred geography created social order through religious authority, functioning like medieval sanctuary laws. The role of religious specialists shows organised religious hierarchy beyond simple shamanism. Godar, chieftain priests, combined religious and political authority. Völvas, seeresses, commanded respect and high payment for services. Different specialists handled different religious needs: healing, divination, ritual, prophecy. This specialisation shows developed religious institutions, not primitive superstition. Ancestor veneration in Norse religion involved complex beliefs about death, memory, and continued existence. The dead weren't simply gone, but remained present in burial mounds, protecting descendants. Disrespecting ancestors brought misfortune. Honouring them brought prosperity. This created social continuity across generations, with religious obligation reinforcing family and community bonds. The conversion to Christianity reveals Norse paganism's sophistication through the complex syncretism that occurred. Vikings didn't simply abandon old gods for new ones, but negotiated between religious systems. Christ became a powerful god who could coexist with traditional deities. Christian festivals merged with pagan celebrations. Sacred sites were repurposed rather than destroyed. This religious flexibility shows sophisticated understanding of divinity beyond rigid dogma. Religious art and symbolism shows complex visual theology. The picture stones of Gotland encode elaborate mythological narratives, requiring deep religious knowledge to interpret. Decorative programs on buildings and objects carried religious meaning. The famous Viking Age pendants that could be either Thor's hammers or Christian crosses show deliberate religious ambiguity. This symbolic complexity reveals sophisticated visual communication about religious concepts. The relationship between religion and law shows how Norse paganism structured society. Oaths sworn on sacred rings carried legal force. Religious festivals provided frameworks for legal assemblies. Breaking religious taboos had legal consequences. The integration of religious and legal authority created social order through divine sanction. This wasn't primitive superstition, but sophisticated social organization through religious institution. Comparative mythology shows Norse paganism's connections to broader Indo-European religious traditions. Similar gods, myths, and concepts appear across Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, and even Hindu traditions. Vikings weren't isolated primitives, but participants in ancient religious traditions spanning continents. Their mythology preserved ancient Indo-European religious concepts in uniquely Scandinavian forms. The literary preservation of Norse mythology, primarily in Iceland, shows its intellectual importance to Viking descendants. Christian Icelanders spent enormous effort recording pagan myths, not to mock them, but to preserve cultural heritage. The sophistication of preserved mythological literature suggests even more complex oral traditions. This preservation effort shows Norse paganism was valued as intellectual and cultural treasure, not dismissed as primitive superstition. As we reach the end of our journey through Viking myths and realities, it becomes clear that everything we thought we knew about these remarkable people needs fundamental reconsideration. The Vikings weren't the one-dimensional raiders of popular imagination, but complex, sophisticated people who shaped the medieval world in ways we're still discovering. Every archaeological excavation, every DNA analysis, every careful reading of the sagas reveals new layers of complexity that shatter our simplistic stereotypes. The real Vikings were entrepreneurs and explorers, poets and lawmakers, craftsmen and traders, farmers and families. They were people who loved beauty, valued education, cherished their children, and built societies that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility. They created art that still takes our breath away, told stories that still move us to tears, and established legal principles that influence democratic development. They were, in short, fully realized human beings, not the cartoonish barbarians of popular culture. The persistence of Viking myths tells us as much about ourselves as about them. We've needed Vikings to be simple barbarians, because it makes us feel civilized by comparison. We've needed them to be purely violent because it justifies our own historical violence. We've needed them to be primitive because it supports narratives of inevitable progress. But Vikings refuse to fit our convenient categories, forcing us to reconsider not just their history, but our assumptions about human development. Modern scholarship continues to revolutionize our understanding of Vikings. DNA analysis reveals their genetic diversity and widespread integration. Isotope analysis tells us what they ate and where they travelled. Climate science helps us understand the environmental pressures they faced. Digital humanities allow us to analyse sagas in new ways. Every year brings discoveries that complicate our picture of Viking Age Scandinavia. The climate crisis has given us new appreciation for Viking adaptability. They survived the medieval warm period's end, adapted to Little Ice Age conditions, and maintained successful societies in some of Earth's most challenging environments. Their sustainable practices in Iceland, their adaptation to Greenland's harsh conditions, and their flexible response to environmental change offer lessons for our own climate challenges. Gender studies have revealed the Viking Age as more egalitarian than most medieval societies. Women's economic rights, legal protections, and social freedoms in Viking society challenge our assumptions about inevitable historical patriarchy. The discovery of female warriors, traders, and explorers forces us to reconsider women's roles in all historical periods. Viking women weren't exceptions, but participants in a society that valued their contributions. Post-colonial scholarship has reframed Viking expansion as more than simple conquest. Vikings often integrated with local populations, adopted local customs, and contributed to local cultures. They were immigrants and refugees as well as conquerors. Their settlements often succeeded through cooperation rather than domination. This nuanced view of cultural interaction challenges simplistic colonizer-colonized narratives. The study of Viking slavery forces uncomfortable recognition of systematic oppression within this seemingly free society. Vikings enslaved thousands, traded humans as commodities, and built prosperity on forced labour. Yet they also had mechanisms for manumission, and slave descendants could achieve high status. This complex reality defies both apologetics and simple condemnation. Religious studies have revealed Norse paganism as sophisticated theology, deserving serious academic attention. The philosophical complexity of Norse cosmology, the psychological depth of Norse mythology, and the social functions of Norse religion show religious thought as complex as any world religion. The syncretism during Christian conversion shows religious flexibility and theological sophistication on both sides. Economic history has revealed Vikings as medieval venture capitalists who created the first global economy. Their trade networks connected 4 continents, their currency systems enabled international commerce, and their credit arrangements pioneered international finance. They weren't destroying civilization but building new economic systems that would shape European development. Literary studies continue to reveal the saga's extraordinary sophistication. These aren't primitive adventure stories, but complex literature exploring universal themes with psychological depth. The saga's influence on modern literature, from Wagner to Tolkien to Marvel, shows their enduring power. Yet each generation discovers new layers of meaning in these ancient texts. Archaeological discoveries continue at an amazing pace. New ship burials, settlement sites, and artifact assemblages constantly emerge. Each discovery adds details that complicate our picture of Viking life. The warrior woman of Birka, the Galloway horde's religious diversity, the Repton cemetery's demographic complexity. Each find forces reassessment of what we thought we knew. Digital reconstruction allows us to experience Viking Age sites in new ways. Virtual reality reconstructions of Viking Age York, Dublin and Trondheim let us walk Viking streets. 3D modelling of Viking ships reveals construction techniques. Digital databases allow pattern recognition across thousands of artifacts. Technology is revolutionising Viking studies in ways unimaginable even a decade ago. The popular culture phenomenon of Viking shows no signs of abating, but it's evolving. Video games, television shows, and movies increasingly incorporate genuine historical research alongside fantasy elements. The hunger for Viking content reflects modern anxieties about identity, belonging, and cultural change. Vikings have become mirrors for contemporary concerns about immigration, integration, and cultural transformation. Educational approaches to Vikings are changing, moving from memorizing dates of raids to understanding complex societies. Students examine Viking Age primary sources, analyze archaeological evidence, and debate historical interpretations. This critical approach produces more sophisticated understanding than old narratives of inevitable progress from barbarism to civilization. The nationalist appropriation of Viking imagery by extremist groups has forced scholars to actively combat misuse of history. The reality of Viking diversity, cooperation and integration directly contradicts racial purity narratives. Scholars now actively engage in public education to prevent historical misappropriation. The fight for accurate Viking history has become part of larger struggles against historical misinformation. Climate science has revealed how environmental factors shaped Viking expansion and contraction. The medieval warm period enabled Greenland settlement. The Little Ice Age ended it. Understanding these climate connections helps us appreciate Viking adaptability and vulnerability. Their responses to climate change offer both warnings and inspiration for our own climate crisis. Genetic studies continue to reveal Viking legacy in unexpected places. Millions carry Viking ancestry without knowing it. Population genetics shows Vikings as ancestors to much of Northern Europe. Not vanished people, but successful colonizers whose descendants thrived. This genetic legacy complicates ethnic nationalism and racial purity myths. Experimental archaeology brings Viking technology to life. researchers build Viking ships, weave Viking textiles, and forge Viking weapons using period techniques. These experiments reveal the skill, knowledge, and effort required for Viking crafts. They show Vikings as master craftsmen, not primitive makers. Museum exhibitions increasingly present complex Viking realities rather than simple stereotypes. Interactive displays, authentic reconstructions, and contextual presentations help visitors understand Viking life's complexity. Museums struggle to balance popular expectations with historical accuracy, but increasingly choose complexity over simplification. International collaboration has revolutionized Viking studies. Scholars from Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, Russia, and North America share data and interpretations. This collaboration reveals Vikings as international phenomenon requiring international study. No single nation owns Viking history. It belongs to all their descendants and cultural inheritors. The ethics of Viking studies increasingly acknowledge indigenous peoples displaced by Viking expansion. Sami perspectives on Viking-age Scandinavia, Inuit views of Norse Greenland, and Native American accounts of Viking contact complicate triumphant expansion narratives. These perspectives remind us that Viking success often came at others' expense. Social media has democratized Viking history, allowing anyone to access scholarship and contribute observations. Online communities discuss archaeological discoveries, debate saga interpretations, and share enthusiasm for Viking culture. This democratization brings both opportunities for education and challenges of misinformation. The future of Viking studies looks extraordinarily bright. New technologies, methodologies, and perspectives constantly emerge. Each generation discovers new meanings in Viking history relevant to contemporary concerns. Vikings continue to fascinate because they represent human possibility, the capacity for both creation and destruction, integration and isolation, tradition and innovation. As we strip away the myths and stereotypes, the real Vikings emerge as even more fascinating than the fictional versions. They were people of extraordinary adaptability who built sophisticated societies in challenging environments. They created literature that still moves us, laws that still influence us, and connections that still bind us. They were violent and peaceful, primitive and sophisticated, traditional and innovative. The Vikings remind us that human societies are never simple, that historical change is never inevitable, and that cultural interaction is always complex. They challenge our assumptions about progress, civilization, and human nature. They force us to recognize that people 1,000 years ago were as intelligent, creative, and complex as we are today. Perhaps most importantly, Vikings remind us that history is never finished. Each generation must rediscover the past, finding new meanings relevant to contemporary challenges. The Vikings we understand today aren't the Vikings our grandparents knew, and our grandchildren will understand them differently still. This isn't historical relativism, but recognition that the past speaks differently to each present. The real Viking legacy isn't horned helmets or berserker rage, but the reminder that human societies can transform themselves, that cultures can merge and emerge stronger, and that even the harshest conditions can produce beauty, wisdom, and meaning. Vikings show us that our stereotypes about the past are usually wrong, that ancient peoples were more sophisticated than we assume, and that understanding history requires constant questioning of what we think we know. So the next time you see a horned helmet or hear about Viking raiders, remember the real story of traders who connected continents, poets who created literature, women who owned property, and societies that adapted to anything the world threw at them. Remember that Vikings didn't disappear but evolved, becoming the ancestors of millions and influencing the development of the modern world in countless ways. The Vikings we're just beginning to understand are far more interesting than the myths we've been told. They were our ancestors, not just genetically but culturally, legally and linguistically. Their struggles with climate change, immigration and cultural transformation mirror our own. Their solutions and failures offer lessons for our contemporary challenges. As we close this exploration of Viking myths and realities, one truth becomes clear. The real Vikings were neither the savage raiders of our nightmares nor the noble warriors of our fantasies. They were people, complex, contradictory and utterly human, and in understanding them better, perhaps we understand ourselves a little better too. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the myths and realities of Viking history. May your own voyages of discovery be as rich and rewarding as those of the Vikings themselves. And remember, question everything you think you know about history, because the truth is always more interesting than the myths.